when I was 14. And I taught Sunday school and ran youth groups for a large part of my growing up, pretty much right until I started my candidacy and moved to churches that didn't need to have Sunday school and youth group because they didn't have as many young people. But that's a huge part of who I am. And then also, I am an ally with Indigenous people. The photo that's in the corner is a picture of me and some Indigenous and non Indigenous youth as we're in New York going to the UN, to the Permanent Forum on the Rights of Indigenous People. And so I have had opportunities to work with and to be with Indigenous people, um, and to try to be the best ally I can towards them. All of that is part of who I am, and you'll see that all of that has influenced both the question and um, how I chose to research it, and even maybe some of my conclusions. But I'll leave that interpretation up to you. So back to the church geek in me, the part that really inspired me to do this particular project was this line that comes from the apology to Indigenous people from the United Church of Canada that happened in 1986. It says, "We tried to make you be like us, and in so doing, we helped to destroy the vision that made you what you are." What you were. And as a result, you and we are poorer, and the image of the Creator in us is twisted, blurred, and we are not what we are meant by God to be. And so, communicated in this apology is this idea that the brokenness of the relationship between settlers and Indigenous people doesn't just affect settlers and Indigenous people, it also affects the way that we see God. But even though I hear that, and even though that's what that apology communicates to me, what I see so often in the United Church is that we silo the idea of faith formation and learning who God is with justice issues and sort of the work of being the church. And we often, those two things are separated, and never more shall the two meet. And so that's really one of the reasons why I wanted to do this project, is because part of me is in both worlds. And so I see both worlds and I love both worlds, but I don't often hear them talking to one another or into one another. And so in thinking about what is sort of a biblical model, or who sort of did the work of the church, was the church in the world, but also worked really hard on faith formation, I thought of Saul Paul, who, after his conversion, Paul was able to both act as a servant within his community and to work with churches in faith formation. And so, could Paul's story be a biblically based model for how we start to bridge that gap? That was sort of a wondering of mine going into the project. I chose narrative, and as Dr. Sinos explained, narrative is a particular type of qualitative research that tries to capture the stories of individuals. And I chose it partially because we're in the middle of a pandemic, and so it's much easier to have very small meetings between individuals than it is to have any type of large group setting. But also because this type of research has traditionally been used by marginalized groups. So in studying of marginalized groups, narrative has been chosen as a form that kind of speaks more to traditional knowledge than Western styles of knowledge. But at the same time, as somebody whose research past has always been in quantitative and always been in science, this is the furthest away from how I have ever researched before. So this was a huge stretch for me and a growth for me to not only do qualitative research, but to do qualitative research in this very non-Western sort of way. And so there's limitations to narrative research. One of them is that it can't really be prescriptive. We can't um, we can't say these two stories are just like everyone else, because obviously each story is an individual, and also um, we don't really have a big enough sample size to say this is true of everyone. But what we can learn from individual stories is sort of start to get an idea of what the problem might look like, or what the solutions might look like, or what are some things that we can learn from an individual stories. Because of course, each individual person has something that they can teach us. So that's narrative. For the purpose of my study, I chose, rather than defining what an ally is, or telling people to self-identify as an ally to be a part of my study, I chose to pick people who had done a certain action that I defined as being an ally action. And so for this, I chose people who had facilitated the Kairos blanket exercise. The blanket exercise, which I know that many who are on this webinar are familiar with, is a participatory history lesson that was developed by Kairos Canada in collaboration with Indigenous elders to try to teach people about Indigenous history, and to try and create respect between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. But one of the things that Kairos has insisted on is that Indigenous elders be included within the facilitation of the blanket exercise. And that means that settlers who facilitate the blanket exercise have to have a working relationship with Indigenous people in order to facilitate the exercise with them, but also have to be taking this action into trying to educate other settlers about Indigenous history. And so I took this idea that blanket exercise facilitators are allies, and then chose two people who were our blanket exercise facilitators to tell their stories, and to look at, has being a part of facilitating the blanket exercise or other actions that they might have taken, has that had an effect on their spiritual development? And so I picked two individuals, and the scientist in me, even though I was only picking two individuals, really wanted to still try to be representative of people within the church. So we have a female and a male. Um, I Unfortunately, in this short webinar, I'm not going to be able to tell you the whole story of the people who I am calling Caitlin and Matthew in order to protect their identity. There's just no way I can put both of their stories within half an hour. It's undoable, but I will tell you a little bit about them. So Caitlin is a female. She's a lay person. She grew up in the suburb of a major American city. She moved to Canada as a young adult and has lived in Canada in various places. She currently lives in a rural area. She's a retired teacher who has a history of studying spiritual direction, and she's involved in her local church, specifically the worship committee and around some strategic planning things. And she's a blanket exercise facilitator. Matthew is a male. He's retired clergy. He's pretty much always lived within the same province in Canada, minus a summer internship during his studies. He currently lives in a rural area. He also is a former teacher. He has a history of working within chaplaincy. He traveled to Central America with the United Church Partner Group at one point. He's involved in his local church, and he's a blanket exercise facilitator. So taking all of these stories and looking at them, there's a couple things that I really felt called to tell you about today. And so I'm just going to take those things out and encourage you, if you find this interesting, I promise you I'll have the paper done by the end of the semester, and you can read kind of a fuller thing come January on the AST library website. So the first thing is that both of them expressed that they had each had a different parent, but they both talked about being raised with sort of this attitude that it was important to be inclusive, what I'm calling a pro inclusion attitude. So Caitlin said of her mother, the Jim Crow laws in the South and so on, my mother was always very critical of them. But she always said we did terrible things to Native people. And she didn't really tell me what it was, just terrible. Like it was. I don't remember the exact word, but that's all she had to say was we treated them terribly. Similarly, Matthew, when talking about his father, said, my father seemed to be quite a person for including the natives and the Negroes and so on. So I got that part of it. I think I have inherited that. He was a very kind person. I experienced him as unconditional love. And so we have this idea that both of them are really expressing that they had this parental influence that sort of leaned them into being open to including other people. I will say, as I read these quotes, these are in the language, these are directly from conversations I had with the participants. So they might not be words that I would use, but it's really important in narrative research to capture the words of the participants. So the second thing is that they both had an incident that caused some tension between them and Indigenous people. In Caitlin's case, her and her partner were homesteading with another couple in part of Canada on a piece of land. And there was a right of way on that piece of land for um, for Indigenous people to be able to get to their fish nets. And there was an incident where the Indigenous people were trying to kind of build a road instead of taking sort of a footpath through the property. And so she describes part of the incident as this. These young guys purposely walk through our partner's garden and they brought a chainsaw to make the path down to their fishing nets. And that was quite threatening, and in the end it felt like a violation. A path is fine, but a road is something different. And so there was a confrontation between our partners and these young guys. Similarly, Matthew, when he was a teacher, had an incident where there was an Indigenous student within his class who he found quite threatening. And so he described that incident as, he came in and we were talking and I say something to him and I tapped him on the head with a plastic ruler. Well, pencil and pen came right out and he told me he wasn't afraid of me. So I retaliated, well, I'm not afraid of you. But it was a threat. And I just thought that he was too much. We have children who go to school there too. On another occasion, I sort of restrained him from something or other, and so he had left the class. He ended up going to the principal's office, and apparently they said, if you're not staying, then take the lock you have back to the classroom. So he appeared back in the class, and I don't know whether he was thinking of throwing it at me or not, but it hit the floor. That's the thing that I don't feel proud of. And so both of them had these incidences before they developed a relationship with Indigenous people that created some tension between them and Indigenous individuals. But when speaking about their faith journey, there was a couple different things that came out. One of them in particular was the United Church Education Centers. And both Caitlin and Matthew mentioned United Church Education Centers so often that I was unable to take a quote out about United Church Education Centers that didn't include the names and therefore give away some of their confidentiality. So I can't really stress enough how important the centers were to their development of their relationships with Indigenous people. Caitlin described that because she had gone to the centers before for programs around spirituality and some of that training she had done, that she felt comfortable going back into that space to do something that was going to be really difficult. She actually went to a program that was around listening to residential school stories, but the space was part of what enabled her to be able to do that. And Matthew similarly described that when he went to Central America, the orientation for that program had been held at a center. And so his familiarity with the center helped him to be comfortable to go back there in order to engage in a program around an Indigenous settler gathering. Also, part of that was the people that they were going to those programs with. So Caitlin described that she recognized the names of the non-Indigenous facilitators because they had been facilitators at other center programs that she had been at. And therefore she was able to be invited into that space because she had a safety around both the facilitation and the place. And Matthew talked about how when he went to that first gathering between Indigenous and settler people, he did so with some people who were on the Presbytery's Church in Action or Justice Committee. And so that helped him feel comfortable going to that space because he was going with people who he knew to a place that he knew. In talking about what they actually learned about their spirituality, they both talked about having sort of a more embodied idea of faith that came out of their relationship with Indigenous people. I'll start with Matthew this time. He said, as far as the native spirituality, I would say it strengthened my spirituality more than anything else because there's more hands-on with it. They deal with things that are happening in this world. And it seems to me in a lot of churches, we hear too much about what a glorious thing it's going to be in the next world. And Caitlin actually said something Caitlin said, I was very moved by it. And I can't honestly say exactly what it was that moved me, but it just opened me up to a sense that spirituality was a lived daily experience, which is Native people's ways of being and looking at the world. Being an outdoors person, I don't know if before that time I would have had a sense that there was something called spirituality in nature, but I knew that I often felt touched by God in nature. And when it comes to taking walks, living in a rural area, and I saw that it was a place where I could find peace and find communion in a way. And then from there on. So both of them described how they sort of saw in Indigenous people and in their relationships with them, how their faith was a lived experience or an embodied, it was part of who they were. And it encouraged both of them to start to think about their own Christian faith in that more embodied, hands-on way. So that's one thing that we see out of both of these people who developed an allyship relationship with Indigenous people. And the other aspect was a sense of ancestry. And I'm going to start with Matthew. Matthew said, the natives have their spirituality and they talk about their ancestors and how they keep in touch with the ones who have gone before. And they have great respect for everything around them. You know, the rocks. They say all my relations. And I used to think that meant you know your relations, your cousins and uncles and family and whatever. And I mentioned that one time in a circle. And I said, all my relations, I used to think human relations, but it includes everything, all the little bugs and even the rocks. And well, anyway, when we were around the circle, one of the elders corrected me that I'd left one thing out, and that was the ancestors, all my relations, is a connection with the ancestors as well as with the rest of it as well. And so there was kind of this bigger idea of who all my relations is. And I can say that in my conversations with Matthew, he would often ask me about my own ancestry and share part of his ancestry. So there was this idea of the great cloud of witness that was very real after spending time with Indigenous people. And Caitlin really expressed this very well. um, she said, because of my connection with Indigenous peoples and hearing them talk about ancestors, now I can just feel my mother's presence. And people have those feelings, but I acknowledge them as real and that I can invite them. Or sometimes there's a sense that they're inviting me to be present with them, and that makes me feel unafraid of death. That's where I'll be. I'll be out there in the ether. I'll be that spirit with my children and my grandchildren, and they will recognize me just as a moment of maybe memory or just that little bit of closeness. And I hope they'll stay with that moment and acknowledge that it is. I am with you. And so there's this idea that they've taken this concept of ancestry within Indigenous spirituality and taken it into this idea of the great cloud of witness, and the idea that we have within Christianity, that people are very much alive still, and that they have been able to really experience this, having had these relationships with Indigenous people, which is was just really beautiful and really touching to hear them express that. Unfortunately, one of the other things that became quite clear in the study is that people is that both Caitlin and Matthew were having these experiences outside of their local congregation, and that there wasn't always a comfort level with coming and bringing these ideas or these learnings that they'd learned from United Church centers back to their home congregations. And so um, Caitlin was more hesitant to say this. Matthew was very clear that this had been his experience. So Caitlin said, usually our local pastoral charge is the last one. There's a fear in coming to your home territory, and I can appreciate Jesus going back to Nazareth. Is that the story where he kicks the dust off his feet? So the blanket exercises. It was one of the last ones was at our church. But I have done and I've led other things, but I do it through the worship committee. So it's the worship committee is hosting blah 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 something, and we all share that part. And what we don't want, we give it to the minister. You figured this one out. So there was this idea expressed by Caitlin that there was safety if she was presenting something as part of the worship committee, but to present something as her own self might leave her kind of exposed to these feelings of not being welcome. Um, Matthew said, there's many quotes from Matthew that express this idea. The one I picked for the presentation, he says, I already have preached in a local church when they asked me to, which hasn't been this year or last year, but sometime in the year before. So I gave it a slant towards the importance of the Aboriginal, how they operate and so on. And I must say, I haven't been back to speak since then. And so where do we go from here, or what can we glean from these stories? So I think one of the first things that we can learn is that pro-inclusion messages in early childhood really do matter. We have two people here who are retired professionals who both recall that those messages were taught to them as children, even still today. And so it's really important that when we're talking about faith formation, when we're talking about what we teach kids in Sunday school, that we remember that these pro-inclusion messages will potentially stick with them, that this type of messaging is important even in early childhood. That just because there's a strained relationship now doesn't mean that it's hopeless. So as I said, both Matthew and Caitlin told me about a time when there had been some tension early on in their beginning relationships with Indigenous people. But now I would consider both of them to be strong allies. And so just because we have strained relationships now, it doesn't mean that it always has to be that way. It doesn't mean that we can't educate and learn more and be invited to United Church Centers in order to engage in the topic and have our minds changed. Um, and I would say, particularly maybe for me, who is a blue noser in this current climate, that's a really hopeful message. This idea that just because there's tension now doesn't mean that there has to be tension forever. It doesn't mean that we're in a hopeless situation that can't improve. The United Church training centers are allowing for people to have brave conversations. As I said, the United Church training centers were mentioned so often within these conversations that I couldn't even give you a quote without giving away what I was talking about. And so I think it's really important to support our centers and to recognize that these places that are kind of away from church are allowing people to have these important conversations that they don't necessarily feel comfortable about having in their local congregations. The established relationships help to invite people in. So when we know the facilitators, when we know the people in presbytery, that allows us to have some tough conversations about some new topics. As if we trust the people that we're with and we have strong relationships with them, then we can start to discuss difficult things like Indigenous justice and reconciliation. That two of the things that I'm seeing that are particular with people who are Indigenous allies, spiritual developments that they're having, are in relation to a connection with their ancestry or this great cloud of witness, and that they're having this sense that there's a more embodied faith, that there's this idea that their faith too can be more hands on, and they're learning this from their relationships with Indigenous people. And of course, my last point is that we have a lot of work to do in order to create churches that are both able and ready to hear the learning that comes from these allies. So even though we can do all this great work and we have these groups of people who are able to support one another out of the center or out of presbytery in Matthew's case, or out of a local committee or out of a blanket exercise facilitation group, if they aren't comfortable to come home to their local congregation and speak those same messages, or if they feel like they won't be heard or that it could be dangerous for them to do so and still be included in their communities, that shows that we as church still have a lot to do to change the culture of our congregations so that they too can be these brave spaces, just like our centers are now. And so I wanted to go back to the beginning and talk about Saul Paul. And so in listening to these stories and then reflecting on Paul, Paul had come from a culture of place and privilege, and he had a history of persecuting the people who he eventually served with. He has a conversion that relied on the vulnerability of other people. He uses his skills of power in order to lift voices up. He uses those skills that he gained from a place of privilege in order to talk about Gentiles and Gentile culture, for instance. He's able to translate things across culture because he develops relationships with both. He had to leave the synagogue in order to create new faith spaces and communities. He speaks a lot about the strength that comes from embracing diversity. And of course, his letters continue to transform the faith and transform the church. And so to me, it sounds like the Paul Saul story is really similar to these stories of allies. And so I would suggest that if we're looking for a biblical model to base allyship on, that the Saul Paul story might be one story that we can look to in order to build those links. And so to finish off, I'll just say, well, Liwan, I'm really looking forward to answering some questions and hearing from many of you. I know there's lots of wisdom in this virtual space as well. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Emma, for that fascinating and rich story that you wove for all of us. As Emma said, we have come to the Q&A portion. So please don't wait any longer. Ask your questions. You can write them in the Q&A box. If you're having trouble seeing that, you can also write them in the chat. And I know that Emma will be more than happy to respond out of the wisdom that she has gained from doing this research. Okay, we have a question already from Dr. Faber,
Okay.
a professor at AST. She says, in your narrative research, could you talk about the silences that you heard?
Yeah. Well, one that comes to mind right away is actually one of the quotes I read where uh, Matthew was talking about this experience of being invited to preach. And then he had this deep sigh when he said, you know, I haven't been invited back. Like I had that experience and then I haven't been invited back. Um and I would say there were lots of great silences. That was the first one that came to mind. Um there was there was some silence from Caitlin when she was talking about she would have these kind of connections where she would make her own connections between these different things that had happened in her life and say, oh yeah, you're like that is connected to that, or I did change my way of thinking about my faith from that. And there was usually a pause after those type of revelations to kind of sit in that space for a while. So yeah, there were lots of beautiful pauses, and of course silence tells us so much.
Great, thank you. So we have another question, and I'll just give a little preamble to this, not the question itself, but how the question was posed, because we had
Okay.
this in some of the feedback from some of the other presentations. So you all met Matthew Heesing earlier, who is Emma's research partner. And so Matthew is actually here because he had a role earlier. So he's here as a panelist. And so he shared this among the panelist chat, which is essentially like a backstage pass. So if you can't see this question, that's why. But Emma and I can both see it. So he says, when it comes to the allyship of these two individuals, can you speak to the relationship between untwisting ourselves and vulnerably allowing ourselves to be untwisted by others? And he adds that because he's a panelist, he doesn't actually have access to the Q&A box because he's functioning in a different capacity. So,
That's okay.
great question. Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah. Hmm. I think that particularly what comes to mind when thinking through your question, Matthew, um, is this tied to ancestry, where um, what I heard from both people was sort of a there may have been a discomfort with this idea that there was a big man in the sky, that sort of version of God and heaven. Um, but this idea of being tied to your ancestors and them being with you, and sort of the great cloud of witness in that way, really opened them up to to embrace their faith, to really understand. I remember at one point, Matthew even said, I don't really know what's going to happen after. Like I'm not comfortable putting all my eggs in that basket in some ways, because I don't know what's going to happen after, but I do know that I have this connection to what's going on right now. Um, and certainly in even in the quote I read from Caitlin, there was this idea that she no longer needed to fear death because she had this greater understanding that she would always be with her family. So she didn't need to fear leaving them, because she knew that she would always be there. And so I think that's a real way to me, that's like an untwisting of ourselves where we get to learn something new about the divine or a new idea about the divine from having these interactions with a different culture. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks. So we have a couple other questions in the Q&A box. So one from Wilf Bean, and he says it's a comment. We appreciate the references to United Church centers as places for developing ally relations. Do you have suggestions as to how these could be strengthened?
um, Thanks, Wealth. I know that you and I both appreciate United Church Centers as well. Um, yeah, how do we strengthen them? I think that obviously, the United Church Centers need more stable funding. That's been an issue for the last several years. If we make the funding that's available to them too pragmatic, then they can't necessarily respond to these emerging things that are happening. So that would be my first thing, is I think we need to find a way to fund our centers. If there's one thing that came out of my research, it's that these other spaces are really, really important to do this work. So I think if we're serious about, having these tough conversations as a church around racism, around Indigenous justice, then I think we need these spaces and places, and we really need to fund them adequately so they can do that work to the best of their ability. Because what this also shows is that the centers have a history of doing really good work.
Excellent. Okay, so we have another question from that's related to this one. So we'll jump to this one,
Okay.
and it's essentially just if for someone who isn't um, connected already to United Church Education Center or Learning Center, how does one go about starting to access these resources?
Oh, um, yeah, I guess I'm not entirely sure where the person is from, so that changes. But there's several, regionally, and unfortunately, they all have their own websites. So it's difficult to give you like a blanket answer. This is how you access them. Um, in Atlantic Canada, the Tatamagouche Center, is the one here. In Ontario, there's, Five Oaks, um, and then there's the Naramata Center in BC. Unfortunately, we've lost some of our centers in recent years, as I kind of alluded to in the last question. Um, but that's, I would say, look up some of their programming, and, they're all really wonderful places.
Thank you. Okay. So we're going to jump to a question from Laura Hunter, and
Okay.
Laura says, "Do you think there are practices we can introduce to children to help them make connections between their experiences of inclusion or exclusion, or allyship, that would contribute to their faith formation?"
Hmm. The big questions. Yeah, I do think that, um, teaching children how to listen and listen well will enable them to be allies when as they grow. Um, I also think that introducing children to the idea that not everyone believes the way they do or thinks about things the way they do, introducing different worldviews, um, and images of people who look differently than them. Those are all little ways that we can signal that we're inclusive, and also give children sort of a foundation that they can then build allyship upon. I think what I've discovered through this research is that allyship itself is in many ways a spiritual practice that then helps us, um, within our own faith formation. So encouraging children to, think about the people who maybe don't have as much of them, or to really think about what their privileges are and how they can use them to help other people. I think if we start to build in some of those thought processes and skills, that children can really grow into them as they grow up.
Great. So I'm going to kind of put two questions together
Okay.
because we have more questions here than we have time for.
Okay.
So both Dr. Hayter and Suzanne asked questions that, to a degree, deal with the idea of creation and caring for creation. So I'm
Mhm.
wondering if you can relate that specifically to the narratives that you heard and the stories that your participants told. Were there things about it, about their experience that related to taking care of our vulnerable planet?
Yeah, certainly there was. And as I said, like, I wish I could have given you the whole story for both people, but there just simply wasn't the time. Um, they both expressed, I would say Matthew really talked about sort of political advocacy towards dealing with climate change and those types of things. Um, and Caitlin talked more about changing our worldviews in order to make our worldviews more sustainable, thinking about how uh, what we do now is tied, and I would say that this tie to ancestry was part of that, in that, you know, how do we ensure that there's beauty still here for 7 generations. um, so those ideas were certainly something that they both talked about, was these ties to creation were something that um, that they also got out of these experiences as well. Unfortunately, as I said, we just didn't have time to cover everything, but that's certainly something else that could have been pulled out.
Great. Okay. So let's go to a question from Linda Scherzinger.
Okay.
Um, so you mentioned about Paul and Saul, and I personally found that incredibly fascinating. And Linda says, could you say a little about Paul, or about Saul Paul having a conversion that relies on vulnerability of others?
Mm. Yeah. So in the story of Saul and Paul, um, he ends up blinded during his conversion experience as Saul. He ends up blinded on the road, and God goes to Aeneas and asks Aeneas to come and get him. Now, he was persecuting. He was part of a group that was persecuting Christians. And God goes to a Christian and says, "Can you go get him off of the road?" Um, and so Aeneas has to be willing to engage in that relationship again, even though historically, um, uh, even though historically he was persecuted by Paul. He has to be vulnerable enough to enter into that relationship again. And I think whenever we talk about allyship relationships, we have to recognize that we're relying on people who have historically been persecuted by people who look like us or act like us or have the same faith as us, and we're asking them to still enter into relationship with us. So that was the piece that I was reflecting on with Paul.
Great. Okay, we are almost out of time, but there's, as I said, there are more questions than we can ask, than we can answer in this time, or that you can respond to. But there's one in particular that I think is really important to leave with. Yvette Swan, who's a board member for AST, she says, "Are you looking to the UCC to make deeper changes?" And I would love to have you as a Baptist minister who works in a United Church of Canada context, but is not
Mm.
part of the United Church. I would love to expand this to are you looking not just to the UCC as but also to the deeper church to make changes?
Yeah, I think we do need to make changes. I think that's evident in the fact that we have people who are having these profound transformative experiences, um, at the training centers, or facilitating blanket exercises, and there's a feeling of discomfort from them to come back to the church. I think that's evidence that we need to have some profound change. And I would say, Yvette, I know we're both on the Pine Hill board, and so we think a lot about students and how students are in ministry. And I have to say, within my own candidacy process, um, one of the things that I've struggled with is, how can we continue to be prophetic? How do we transform congregations in order to be more willing to engage in these conversations, to have brave conversations? And I think all churches need to do more work uh, to not make church just a consumer product where people come in and they're happy and they get what they pay for through their offering, but to make church and faith something that actually can transform us and can allow us to have really difficult conversations with one another in order to transform our society. Because I think if we have seen anything over, even over this pandemic, where some of those little fractures have really turned into deep chasms, that we really need transformative change in this world. And I think the church could do that. Um, and so that would be my answer. I hope so. Yes, all the way.
Great. Thank you so much, Emma. This was filled with wisdom, and I appreciated how much of the stories, as you said, there's no way you could have given us all the bends and arcs in these stories, but you certainly gave us a lot. So thank you for sharing them, for interpreting them, and for telling us a little bit about why you think they matter to you, to us, and to the church as a whole. Thank you to all of you who have been participating in this webinar. If you've been to other ones, thank you for coming to those as well. I put a link in the feedback, a link in the chat to the feedback form. So please head over there and fill out that form so we can get a sense of what you thought of Emma's presentation and what you thought about this webinar series as a whole. This is a new way for us to share grad project research this year. So thank you for joining us into this experiment this year. Uh, that is all we have for today. We are slightly over time, but again, thank you to Emma. Thank you to all of you, and enjoy the rest of your day.